$287. That was the price written in black ink on the paper, nailed to a flour barrel in Mercy Gulch. It could buy a sound mule team. It could buy a claim on timberland. It could buy enough powder, salt, and coffee to keep a man alive through a mountain winter. It was not supposed to buy a woman and her 5 children. Silas Ward had come down from the high timber with 6 months of pelts on his pack mule and one plan in his head: trade fast, speak little, get back above the snow line before the first hard freeze. He wanted no wife, no children, no town trouble, no voices in his cabin after dark. But the moment the auctioneer raised his hand over that shaking family, the old trapper stepped out of the crowd and spent his whole winter stake on 6 lives nobody else thought were worth saving. Mercy Gulch sat in a fold of bad country where the sagebrush gave up and the mountains began. It was not a town so much as a wound with hitching posts. 2 saloons, 1 mercantile, a livery that smelled of rot, and a church frame no one had finished because whiskey made better money than sermons. Silas hated the place. He had spent most of his adult life above it, trapping beaver along cold creeks and sleeping under ledges where a man could hear wolves better than lies. That autumn he came in leaner than he had gone out, with frost already silvering his beard and a leather pouch heavy with gold at his belt. He meant to buy flour, cartridges, axle grease, lamp oil, and a sack of beans, nothing more. Then he heard the baby cry. It was not the thin, hungry whimper he had heard around mining camps. It was sharper than that. A sound pulled out of a body that had run out of strength. Silas stopped in the street. A crowd had formed beside Grady's mercantile, boots planted in dust, hats tilted low, men grinning the way men grin when cruelty is not going to cost them anything. Silas pushed through them without asking leave. Men looked back to swear at him, then saw the size of his shoulders under the wolfskin coat and made room. In the center of the square stood a loading platform. On it was a woman in a sun-bleached brown dress, holding an infant wrapped in a feed sack. 4 more children clung near her legs. The oldest was a girl of 8, thin as a willow switch, trying to stand straight. 2 boys, maybe 5, held one another by the sleeves. A little girl with dirt in her blonde hair hid behind her mother's skirt, too tired even to cry. The woman did not look beaten. That was the thing Silas noticed first. Her cheeks were hollow. Her mouth was cracked. Her wrists were too narrow. But her eyes were steady enough to frighten a weaker man. The paper on the barrel said, "Estate of Daniel Keene. Debt due to Elias Roark. $287. Elias Roark stood below the platform with a cigar clamped between his teeth. Roark owned the saloon, half the livery, most of the town's debts, and the sheriff when the sheriff could be found sober. He had the soft hands of a man who never lifted anything heavier than another man's misfortune. Daniel Keene signed his name. Roark called to the crowd. Fever took him before he paid. Debt does not die because the debtor does. A few men chuckled. Roark tipped his cigar toward the woman. His widow and issue are the estate. I have offers already. The boys can be placed with a narrow shaft outfit south of Purgatory Ridge. Small hands have their uses. The older girl can scrub and haul at my place. The little one can be bound out when she is steadier on her feet. His eyes slid over the widow. And Mrs. Keene can settle the balance upstairs if she has the sense to be grateful. The crowd laughed harder this time. Not all of them. Some men looked down. Some women turned their faces away. But no one stepped forward. The law in Mercy Gulch was a document written far away by men who had never smelled a winter corpse thawing under a cabin floor. Rourke reached for one of the boys. The widow moved before his fingers touched cloth. She slapped his hand aside so hard the sound snapped across the square. "Touch my son," she said, voice raw as scraped hide, "and you will need that hand buried separate." The laughter died. Rourke's face darkened. He raised his arm. Silas moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just forward. One step, then another. The platform boards complained under his weight. He unhooked the leather pouch from his belt and dropped it onto the flour barrel. The sound changed the whole square. Gold has a voice men understand. Rourke stared at the pouch. Silas said, "Count it." Rourke blinked. "For the debt?" "For them." The widow turned toward him. There was no relief in her face, no gratitude, only a new fear being measured. She had just been moved from one kind of danger to another, and she knew better than to trust the shape of a rescue. Rourke loosened the pouch string and looked inside. His greed found the gold before his pride found an argument. "All of them?" he asked. "What is a snowline trapper going to do with 5 brats and a widow?" Silas looked at him until Rourke stopped smiling. "Live with my own bad judgment." Rourke counted quickly. He kept the extra. Men like Rourke always keep the extra. Silas turned to the woman. "What is your name?" For 1 second she did not answer. Then she lifted her chin. "Mara Keene." "Gather what is yours, Mrs. Keene." She looked down at the children. "Nell, take Lottie. Boys, stay to my skirt." The oldest girl seized the little one's hand. The twins pressed close. Mara shifted the baby higher against her chest and picked up a burlap sack that held everything 6 people owned. Silas stepped off the platform and walked away from the square. He did not look back. He could hear the family behind him. Small bare feet in dust. A child's breath catching. A mother's silence held tight enough to cut. By the time Mercy Gulch dropped behind them, the sun had begun bleeding out behind the ridges. Silas led his gray mule up a stony trail through bitterbrush and black pine. Behind him, Mara walked exactly 12 paces back. Not 11. Not 13. 12. Far enough to run if she had to. Close enough to keep the children in sight. Silas understood that kind of distance. The twins stumbled before the 1st-mile marker. They did not complain. That made it worse. Silas stopped the mule. Mara stopped too, pulling the children in like a hen gathering chicks beneath a storm. Silas turned. The boys looked at him as if he were a bear deciding which limb to chew first. "What are their names?" Mara's throat worked. "Owen and Cal. The oldest is Nell. The little one is Lottie. The baby is Jonah." Silas took 1 step toward the twins. Mara shifted in front of them. It was not courage for show. It was a reflex sharpened by hunger. Silas stopped. Then he crouched until his face was level with the boys. "You two ride," he said. They stared. He lifted Owen by the waist and set him on the mule between sacks of flour. Then Cal. The boys froze on the load, hands clamped to the rope, waiting for punishment that did not come. Silas turned back up the trail. "Hold tight." They climbed until the air thinned and the lowland warmth fell away. At dusk, Silas found a granite shelf out of the wind. He dropped his pack and said, Camp. Mara did not collapse. She put Jonah down inside the one blanket they owned, nodded at Nell, and said, "Dry sticks, thumb thick, no green wood." Nell vanished into the trees. Mara went straight to the mule and began undoing knots with hands that knew work. Silas watched her. The hands did not belong to a helpless woman. Knuckles swollen, nails split, palms cross-hatched with old cuts. A worker's hands, a survivor's hands. When she reached for the flour sack, Silas took it before she could strain herself. "I can cook," Mara said. Her voice carried no softness, no pleading. "If you provide rations, I will make them stretch. The children will carry wood, clean gear, mend what they can. We will not be dead weight." There it was. A bargain, not gratitude, not surrender. Value offered because fear had taught her that every roof came with a price. Silas pointed to his pack. Beans, salt pork, hard flour, water in the canteens. Creek is 5 miles north. Don't empty them. Mara nodded once. Within half an hour she had a low fire burning almost smokeless between stones. Nell returned with good kindling. The twins stacked it without being told. Even little Lottie sat beside the blanket and watched the baby with solemn eyes. When the beans were ready, Mara served Silas first. Too much. Then the children. Then she scraped a spoon through the pot and put watery broth in her own cup. Silas looked at his plate, then at hers. He stood, crossed the fire ring, and pushed half his beans into her cup. Mara went still. Her eyes rose to his face. Silas said, "Eat." "I did not ask." "I know." He went back to his place by the rifle. "Can't haul 6 corpses through rock country. Too much trouble." It was a rough lie wrapped around a decent act. Mara looked at the beans, then at the children. Finally she ate. Not quickly. Not like a beggar. Like a woman accepting ammunition. The mountain took 5 days to climb. By the 2nd day Mara's shoes were coming apart. By the 3rd she had wrapped them with strips cut from her underskirt. By the 4th the little girl had to ride with the twins, wedged between sacks, her head nodding with exhaustion. Silas said little, but he watched. Mara did not soften when the children faltered. She rationed comfort the way she rationed food. 1 sip, 1 order, 1 hand on the shoulder. Keep moving. Silas had known men in mining camps with less iron in them. On the 5th afternoon the sky turned green-gray above the ridge. The wind stopped. Every tree in the valley seemed to hold its breath. Silas looked up. Storm. He pushed the mule harder. The first snow came sideways, not down. Needles of ice cut across their faces as the trail narrowed along a rock wall. Then, through the white, Mara saw the cabin. It was no homestead from a calendar. It was a fortress of rough logs and stone, wedged beneath a cliff as if the mountain itself had tried to hide it. A squat chimney, a dirt yard, a skinning rack, a door thick enough to stop weather or men. Silas shoved it open. Inside, the air smelled of old ash, cured hides, iron traps, and loneliness. 1 bed built into the wall. 1 table, 1 stove, stacks of pelts, rifles on pegs, no curtains, no cradle, no second cup set out for anyone. Mara stood on the threshold with the baby against her chest. She scanned the room like a soldier studying ground. Corners, door, window, weapons, firewood. His sleeping place. The children's possible sleeping place. Then she stepped in. Silas pointed. Matches in the tobacco tin. Wood by the wall. He went back into the snow for the mule. When he returned with the supplies, the cabin had already begun changing. The stove roared. Nell was sweeping the dirt floor with a pine bough. The twins were carrying small sticks to the wood box. Mara had shaken dust from the bed canvas and laid the blanket across the tick. Silas dropped a sack hard enough to raise dust. "That's my bed." Mara turned. Her face was pale from cold. Her lips were split. Her eyes did not lower. "The children sleep off the floor. Damp settles in their chests. I built that bed. I see that. It fits one. Then the 5 smallest bodies get it." Silas stared at her. He could have ended the argument by size alone. Instead, he walked to the far wall, pulled down 3 buffalo robes, and threw them near the stove. "I sleep by the fire," he said. "Old bones prefer heat." Mara's expression shifted for half a heartbeat. Not relief, not trust. Something smaller. A crack in the wall she kept around her face. Then she turned and lifted the children into the bed. For 3 days the storm sealed the cabin. Snow climbed over the window. Wind clawed at the roof. The world beyond the door vanished into white violence. Inside, 6 bodies learned the rules of a room meant for 1 man. Silas expected crying. He expected broken cups. He expected the nervous ruin that people bring when they have been cornered too long. He got discipline. Mara ran the cabin like a winter post. Nell kept kindling sorted. Owen and Cal rubbed rust from old traps with ash and rags. Lottie folded scraps of cloth into neat piles. Mara cooked, swept, mended boiled water, checked the baby, and patched Silas's torn canvas coat with tiny, hard stitches. She was not making the place pretty. She was making it work. Every task said the same thing. "We are not charity. We are not your burden. We will pay for our breathing." Silas did not know what to do with that. So he did what he knew. He hunted when weather broke. He split wood. He checked snares. He taught the twins which tracks belonged to hare and which belonged to fox. He showed Nell how to keep a knife edge away from her own thumb. He did not call it kindness. Men like Silas often hide tenderness under practical instruction. December locked the valley. The cold did not merely arrive. It took possession. At night, frost furred the inside of the window. The chimney pipe ticked like a nervous tooth. The children slept in a pile of robes, their breath rising in little clouds before the stove caught again. Mara learned the cabin's hunger. How much flour made a pan of ash bread. How long beans could be soaked before boiling. How to scrape marrow out of bones until they shone white. How to roast chicory and pine seed into something that almost lied like coffee. Silas learned Mara's silence. There was the silence that meant she was counting food. The silence that meant she had pain in her feet. The silence that meant she had heard something outside before anyone else. And then came the silence that meant fear. It came in January. Silas woke before dawn to a wet, broken breathing. Not the wind, not the stove, a child. He sat up. Across the cabin, Mara was already awake, kneeling by the bed with Jonah in her arms. The baby was burning so hot Silas could feel it before he touched him. Mara's iron face was gone. In its place was a mother staring at the edge of a grave. "His chest is full," she whispered. "He can't pull air." Silas crossed the room. "Table. No, it's cold." "Table." She tightened her hold. Silas said her name for the first time. "Mara." The word landed between them. "If you want him breathing, put him on the table." She searched his face. Whatever she found there was not gentleness. But it was not cruelty either. It was knowledge. She laid Jonah on the rough planks. Silas moved to the shelves and pulled down a small bundle of dried plants. Willow bark, mint, rabbit tobacco, and a twist of yarrow. "Nell," he said, "snow in the kettle now." The girl moved instantly. Silas shaved Willow into a cup. "Fever first," he muttered, "then lungs." Mara bent over the baby, hands hovering as if touching him wrong might break him. "He is too little. The fever doesn't care." For 9 hours the cabin became a sick room. Steam rose under a canvas tent held above the table. Mara held Jonah upright while Silas fed the stove. Silas dipped linen in bitter tea and squeezed drops onto the baby's tongue. Nell kept the kettle full. The twins sat awake and silent in the bed, holding Lottie between them. Mara did not weep. She hummed, a low wordless sound that shook only when Jonah stopped breathing long enough for the room to freeze. Near dawn the rattle eased. The baby's chest rose once, then again, deeper. His skin cooled under sweat. Mara folded forward until her forehead touched the table's edge. Her shoulders began to tremble. Silas poured chicory water into a tin cup and set it near her hand. She looked up. Tears had cut 2 clean lines through soot on her face. "Why?" she asked. Silas did not answer quickly. He looked at the baby, at the sleeping children, at the woman whose hands had not stopped fighting death all night. Then he said, "A thing still trying to live ought not be handed to men who profit from its dying." Mara stared at him. Silas added, "Rougher now. Drink. You'll fall over before noon." She wrapped both hands around the cup. The winter outside had not softened, but something inside the cabin had. February was worse. The Shoshone called that moon by names that sounded like empty ribs. Silas understood why. The beans ended. The flour sack became a ghost they shook for dust. Hairs came thin from the snares. All bone and string, no fat. A body can starve on lean meat while the mouth is still chewing. The children faded by inches. Owen stopped teasing Cal. Cal stopped answering. Nell's eyes grew too large for her face. Lottie sucked her fingers and stared at the stove as if warmth could fill a stomach. Mara gave away her portions. Silas saw it. She slid rabbit meat from her plate to the twins when she thought his back was turned. He said nothing. The next night he left half his own food untouched. "Makes my guts sour," he grunted. Mara looked at the plate, then at him. They both knew it was a lie. She ate anyway. On the 12th morning of the hard freeze, Silas rose before first light and took his rifle from the pegs. Mara watched from the table. "No." He pulled on his coat. "The elk have dropped below the north ridge. The wind will skin you alive. Then I best keep moving." She stood. "You said the basin is blind in blowing snow." "It is." "Then wait." Silas checked the cartridges in his pocket. "Waiting eats, too." He opened the door. The cold hit the cabin like thrown glass. Before he stepped out, he looked back at her. "Do not open for any voice but mine." Then he was gone. The whiteout erased the world in 10 paces. Silas moved by memory more than sight, past the dead spruce, across the frozen creek under buried snow, up the ridge where the wind cut hard enough to turn breath to needles inside his nose. By noon his beard was a slab of ice. By mid-afternoon he found tracks. Elk. Deep plunges through powder. Fresh scat still steaming faintly in a hollow. He crawled the last 50 yards on his belly. There were 4 cows in the spruce, stripping bark. He needed a clean shot. 1 animal. 1 bullet. No chase. Silas exhaled. The rifle cracked. One cow dropped. Killing was the easy part. Cutting meat in that wind was a punishment. His hands went numb, then clumsy, then dangerous. He took a hindquarter, ribs, and a slab of fat, tied the load with rope, and began the long drag home. Inside the cabin, Mara did not sit. She paced until the floor seemed to remember her steps. Every shriek of wind sounded like a man calling. Every crack from the stove sounded like a rifle. She told herself she feared hunger. That was true, but it was not all. A picture kept forming against her will. Silas lying on his side in white snow, his beard frozen, his rifle half buried, his eyes open to a sky that would not care. That picture hurt more than fear should have. Because sometime between the auction block and that starving cabin, the stranger who had bought a debt had become the post holding up the roof. Near midnight, something struck the door. Not a knock, a body. Mara seized the fire poker. Then a voice scraped through the wind. Mara! She unbarred the door and pulled it open. Silas fell across the threshold with a frozen mass of meat behind him. His face was gray. His lips were blue. Snow filled the seams of his coat. Mara did not scream. She slammed the door, barred it, and dropped to her knees. Nell? Snow bucket. The child moved. Mara dragged Silas toward the stove 1 inch at a time. She cut his frozen laces with his own knife, pulled his boots away, saw the waxy white on 2 toes and both hands. She packed them in snow first. Slow, cruel, necessary. Then wool, then warm cloth, then elk fat broth spooned between cracked lips. For 2 days Silas drifted in and out of black fever. Each time he surfaced, Mara was there, her hand on his brow, her voice ordering the children, her face sharpened by exhaustion and something fiercer than duty. On the second night he opened his eyes and found her beside him. "Meat?" he rasped. Her laugh broke before it became one. "Yes, you impossible man, you brought the meat." His mouth moved toward a smile. "Good." Mara pressed the warm cloth harder against his chest. "You nearly froze yourself dead." "Didn't." "Only because I refused to let you." He looked at her then. Really looked. Not as a woman he had bought out of a town's cruelty. Not as another mouth under his roof. As the reason the cabin still had heat in it. Spring came like a fight. Snow did not melt gently in the high country. It roared down gullies and tore ice from creek beds. Mud swallowed boots. The roof shed slabs of white with cracks like gunfire. Silas kept all his toes but the tip of one. It gave him a slight roll in his walk and a deep dislike for anyone mentioning it. The children recovered first. Nell learned to shoot bottles off a stump with the small carbine Silas cut down for her. Owen and Cal learned snares, fish hooks, and which mushrooms would make a man regret curiosity. Lottie followed Silas with a stick over her shoulder, solemnly claiming she was hunting bears. Jonah grew fat on broth and goat milk traded from a passing Ute family. Mara planted a garden beside the creek. She had carried seeds in the burlap sack all winter. Turnip, bean, potato eyes wrapped in cloth. Silas watched her press them into black soil with the care other women might use on jewelry. "You hauled those through snow?" he asked. Mara covered a row. "I hauled hope. Seeds were lighter." By late April, the trail below the cabin opened. That was when Roark's men came. Silas heard them first. He was splitting wood in the yard, maul raised over his shoulder. Mara stood on the porch rinsing shirts in a tub. 3 riders pushed through the mud below the pines. The lead man was Brand Vale, Rourke's collector, a narrow-faced brute with a red scar along his jaw, and a reputation for finding bones that did not want to be found. 2 gunmen rode behind him. Silas's rifle was inside the cabin. In his hands he had only the maul. Brand drew up 10 yards away. "Silas Ward," he called, "you winter well for a man who owes money." "Paid what was owed." Brand smiled. Rourke found a ledger error. "Interest, care fees, trouble fees, comes to another 200. Mara's hands stilled in the wash water. Brand's eyes lifted to her. "Or we take the woman and the little ones back down. Let Rourke settle the arithmetic proper." Silas's grip tightened on the maul. He could hit Brand. Maybe. He could not beat 3 revolvers. Brand drew his sidearm and cocked it. "Drop the axe, snow rat!" Silas did not move. Mara stepped backward into the cabin. Brand laughed. Smart widow, packing already. 10 seconds later, Mara came back out. Silas's Henry rifle was braced hard against her shoulder. She did not wave it, did not tremble. Her cheek lay against the stock. Her eye was down the sight. "Put the pistol down," she said. Brand looked up at her and grinned. "Lady, that gun weighs more than your arm." Mara shifted the barrel 3 inches. She fired. The bullet cut the silver concho from Brand's saddle horn and drove it into the mud behind him. Before his horse finished rearing, Mara had worked the lever and settled the sights on his chest. "The next one opens you," she said. Nobody laughed. Silas walked forward slowly. The 2 hired men lifted their hands away from their guns. Silas took Brand's revolver, emptied it into the mud, and threw the weapon into the creek. He did the same with the others. Brand's face had gone the color of bad meat. "Rourke will burn you out." Mara kept the rifle steady. "Then tell him to bring a shovel for every man he sends." Silas looked at the riders. "You heard her." They turned their horses down the trail. Mara held the rifle until the hoofbeats faded. Then her hands began to shake. Hard. The barrel dipped. Silas climbed the porch steps. He did not take the rifle from her at first. He placed both hands over hers, covering the white knuckles. "Good shot." Her eyes filled. "I aimed close. I know. I could have killed him." "You kept him from killing me." Her mouth trembled once. Then she stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his coat. Silas stood frozen. Comfort was a language he had not spoken in years. Then slowly he put one arm around her shoulders, then the other, and held on. Summer came bright and short. Mara's garden pushed green through the dark soil. The twins grew brown and loud. Nell became quiet in the dangerous way smart children do. Lottie named every chicken track, boot print, and squirrel mark in the yard as if she were drawing maps for a future kingdom. Silas changed too. He built a lean-to against the south wall. He repaired the roof before it leaked. He widened the bed frame without announcing it. He carved a cradle from a cedar log, sanding it smooth with horsetail rush until no splinter could find a baby's skin. When he carried it onto the porch, Mara stopped with a wet shirt in her hands. The cradle was plain, strong, pegged without nails, lined with rabbit fur soft as breath. "For Jonah," Silas said, suddenly very interested in the ridge line. "Basket's too small." Mara walked to it. She ran her hand along the curved hood. Then she crossed the porch, rose on her toes, and kissed Silas's scarred cheek. "Thank you." The words were simple. The touch was not. Silas closed his eyes. For one wild second, the whole mountain went quiet. By August, they needed supplies: salt, coffee, canvas, boots for the children, a milk goat or cow if one could be had without being robbed blind. Silas still had a few coins hidden under the hearthstone. Mara had cured pelts stacked by grade. They loaded the mule and went down to Mercy Gulch. This time they did not descend like fugitives. They came in together, Silas leading the mule, Mara walking at his side, the children running ahead, sun-browned and solid, nothing like the thin ghosts the town had watched on the auction platform. Mercy Gulch noticed. Hammering stopped, dice stopped, women froze in doorways. Men lowered cups and pretended not to stare. They remembered Mara Keene starving under Roark's paper. The woman walking through town now wore a dress cut from heavy brown canvas, stitched, clean, and fitted for work. A hunting knife hung at her belt. Her hair was braided tight at the nape of her neck. Her shoulders had the level set of a person who no longer expected permission to occupy space. Roark stepped out of his saloon. He had 2 new men behind him. Brand Vale was not among them. Rumor had sent him south with a missing saddle concho and a healthier respect for porches. Roark looked from Silas to Mara. His smile came slow and oily. Well now, the mountain brought back my property. The street went still. Silas's hand shifted toward his rifle strap. Mara put her palm against his chest. Not hard. Enough. Then she walked straight to Roark. I am not property. Roark sneered. You were listed as estate. A debt was listed. The debt was sold. The debt was paid. Interest remains. Mara reached into the pouch at her belt and pulled out 1 gold coin. She flipped it into the dust at Roark's feet. There is your interest. Roark stared down at it. Mara's voice sharpened. For the air we used walking past your door. A murmur moved through the crowd. Roark's face flushed. Mara leaned closer. If you speak of my children again, I will not answer you in coin. She turned her back on him. That was what broke him. Not the rifle. Not Silas's size. Not even the gold. It was the fact that she no longer feared what stood behind her. Silas looked at Roark for 1 long second. Then he smiled. Not kindly. He followed Mara into the mercantile. Inside, Mara traded pelts better than Silas ever had. She caught bad weights, rejected weak boot leather, made the clerk recut canvas when he tried to cheat the edge. She bought peppermint sticks for the children with her own coin, and did not ask Silas whether sweetness was necessary. At the livery, she chose a milk cow with a clean eye and stubborn feet. That one, she said. Silas studied the cow. Mean-looking thing. Good, she will understand us. The cow's name became Bess. Getting Bess up the mountain took 3 days, 2 broken lead ropes, 1 profanity from Mara that made Silas laugh so hard he had to sit on a rock, and a final climb where Silas braced the animal's shoulder while Mara talked it over loose scree like she was negotiating with a judge. By autumn, the cabin was not a trapper's den anymore. It was a homestead. Smoke rose steady from the chimney. Beans dried from rafters. A rail fence marked the yard. The garden gave enough to cellar. The children had chores, places, arguments, and laughter. Silas sometimes stood by the chopping block and watched it all with the stunned expression of a man who had accidentally survived his own loneliness. He had spent 40 years believing a man was safest when he carried nothing he could not abandon. Mara had proved the opposite. Some things did not weigh a man down. Some things gave him a place to stand. One night in October, after the children were asleep under buffalo robes and the first hard frost silvered the yard, Silas sat beside Mara at the table, not across from her. Beside her, she was sewing winter moccasins from oiled hide, pushing an awl through tough leather with careful force. Silas reached into his vest and set a dull silver ring on the table. Mara's hand stopped. The ring had been hammered from an old silver dollar. The face and eagle were gone, the edges smooth, the surface imperfect, heavy, plain, made by fire, patience, and hands that knew more about traps than courtship. Silas cleared his throat. "I got no preacher." Mara looked at the ring. "No, and I don't have fancy words." "No," he swallowed. "I paid Rourke for a debt." "That was a paper thing. I don't want you here because of paper. I don't want you cooking because you owe me. I don't want these children thinking this roof is charity." His voice dropped. "I want you here because this is your mountain if you choose it. Because those children are under my roof and in my blood whether sense approves or not. Because when the wolves came, you stood on the porch." Mara picked up the ring. Her eyes shone in the firelight. "You have been making vows since the day you gave me half your beans," she said. Silas looked down. "Didn't know that counted." It counted. She held out her left hand. "Put it on." Silas took the ring between thumb and forefinger. His hand shook once, only once. He slid the silver over her finger. It fit. Mara closed her hand around his. "I do not need a preacher to tell me what I already know." The wind struck the cabin then, hard from the north, testing the chinking, rattling the shutter, dragging winter behind it. Inside, the stove held. The children breathed. The cow shifted in the lean-to. Mara's hand stayed inside Silas's. The paper on the barrel in Mercy Gulch had said $287. That was all Rourke thought they were. A bad debt, a starving widow, 5 children to be split and used. But paper has never understood the weight of living things. Silas thought he had bought 6 burdens before winter. Instead, he found a home strong enough to outlast every storm that came for it. The debt ended in dust. The family began in snow.